Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. The night detonated without warning, a slow burn fuse igniting into a bombshell that would rip through Genoa City's carefully guarded illusions as Jack and Matt, united by desperation and betrayal, closed in on Victor Newman with a ruthlessness that shocked even themselves, the air in the dimly lit study thick with the scent of leather, whiskey, and impending ruin. Victor standing defiant as ever with that ironclad stare that had broken rivals for decades. Yet for the first time there was a flicker, just a flicker, of miscalculation because Jack's voice was calm, almost tender, when he spoke Victor's name, a tone that suggested reconciliation while Matt circled like a coiled serpent, every step measured, every breath held back, and when Victor turned, suspicion sharpening his features, the moment snapped like a bone under pressure, Matt lunging first, arms locking around Victor's chest, Jack moving in from behind with a precision born not of hatred but necessity. His forearm sliding up, tightening against Victor's throat, the chokehold swift and brutal as Victor's shock exploded into fury, his hands clawing, his body thrashing, the room echoing with the scrape of shoes against polished wood and the guttural sound of a titan refusing to fall. Jack's jaw clenched as memories of boardroom wars, stolen companies, broken families flashed through his mind, the weight of history pressing down on his arm as Matt hissed for him to hold tighter, reminding him there was no turning back, that Victor had crossed a line so unforgivable it demanded bloodless violence, Victor's breath coming in ragged bursts as his strength waned, his mind racing through contingencies, allies, betrayals, realizing too late that this was not another bluff but a coup executed in shadows, his vision blurring as Jack whispered an apology that sounded more like a eulogy, the choke tightening until the mighty Newman sagged, consciousness slipping as the lights of the room dimmed into a tunnel, and when Victor finally went limp, the silence that followed was deafening, Jack releasing him with a shudder as Matt caught the falling weight, both men staring down at the unconscious king they had just dethroned, the enormity of what they'd done settling like ash in their lungs, but there was no time for regret, because sirens, enemies, and consequences were always closer than they seemed in Genoa City, Matt barking orders as they bound Victor's wrists with practiced efficiency, duct tape biting into skin that had once signed empires into existence, Jack averting his eyes as they wrapped a cloth around Victor's face, not to hide him but to silence him when he woke, the act feeling like sacrilege even as it felt inevitable, dragging him through a hidden passage Jack had sworn he'd never use again, the walls closing in, secrets whispering from every brick, their footsteps swallowed by darkness as they hauled Victor toward the waiting van, rain beginning to fall outside like the city itself was trying to wash away the sin unfolding beneath its skyline. The van doors slamming shut with a metallic finality that echoed like a gunshot in Jack's ears, Matt behind the wheel, hands steady, eyes cold, while Jack sat beside Victor, watching the rise and fall of his chest, half expecting him to wake and deliver one of his legendary threats. But Victor remained still, reduced for the moment to a captive, the road stretching endlessly ahead as Genoa City's lights blurred into streaks of gold and red, Jack's mind unraveling as he imagined Nikki's scream when she realized Victor was gone, Victoria's relentless pursuit, Nick's rage, the Newmans mobilizing like an army deprived of its general, and yet beneath the fear was a dangerous clarity, a belief that this kidnapping was not just revenge but survival, that Victor's latest scheme, one so dark it had finally united sworn enemies, left them no other choice, Matt breaking the silence with a bitter laugh as he reminded Jack of every warning ignored, every chance Victor had to stop, the van speeding toward a remote safehouse buried in the woods, a place off the grid where power meant nothing and money couldn't buy freedom, the rain turning to sleet as they arrived, hauling Victor inside, the cold air biting, the cabin lights flickering to life revealing a stark room stripped of comfort, Jack untying the cloth from Victor's face just as his eyes fluttered open, confusion sharpening into fury in an instant, Victor's muffled growl vibrating with promise of retribution, Jack meeting his gaze with a steadiness that surprised them both, telling him this was happening, that the game had changed, that for once Victor would listen instead of command, Matt pacing like a caged animal as Victor tested his bindings, muscles flexing, pride wounded but unbroken, the air crackling with old hatred and fresh terror as Victor finally understood the depth of the betrayal, Jack explaining, voice shaking, despite his resolve, that this was the only way to stop him, to protect everyone Victor was about to destroy in his blind pursuit of control, Victor's eyes blazing as he spat through the gag, his contempt palpable even restrained, the king promising war with every glare, Matt stepping forward, leaning in close, whispering that war had already begun, that choking him unconscious was just the opening move, the realization hitting Victor that this was not a temporary setback but a prison built by men who knew his mind, his habits, his secrets. Jack stepping back as the weight of it crushed him, knowing there was no undoing what they'd done, that Genoa City would wake to a nightmare headline, alliances would shatter, loyalties would be tested, and blood, metaphorical or real, would be spilled before this ended. The storm outside howling like a warning as Victor Newman, the indomitable titan, sat bound and silenced, kidnapped by the last two men he ever believed capable of such an act, the bombshell reverberating outward, promising fallout so massive it would reshape every life it touched, because in Genoa City, no sin stayed buried, and this one had just been dragged screaming into the light. Dawn crept toward Genoa City like an uninvited witness as the next chapter detonated into motion, the kidnapping already metastasizing into panic, paranoia, and power grabs before the sun could even rise, because absence was Victor Newman's loudest presence, and the moment his phone went unanswered the city's predators and protectors alike felt the tremor. Nikki waking with a gasp as if a cord had been severed in her sleep, Victoria's instincts screaming as she stared at a silent screen, Nick pacing like a caged storm while orders were barked, trackers activated, loyalties tested, and yet miles away in the frozen woods the world was smaller and crueler. Victor bound to a chair beneath a single hanging bulb whose light swung with the wind rattling the cabin, each sway carving shadows across his face like the bars of a cell, Jack standing at the window unable to meet his eyes, guilt and resolve wrestling inside him as Matt laid out the rules with merciless clarity. No calls, no theatrics, no grandstanding speeches, because this wasn't a negotiation, it was an intervention born of years of bloodless wars that had finally turned lethal in consequence. Victor's wrists straining against the ties as he tested every weakness with methodical patience, his mind already mapping exits, leverage, and revenge, refusing to grant them the satisfaction of fear, instead offering contempt so sharp it cut through the cold, his muffled laughter vibrating with menace as if to remind them that men who kidnapped kings never survived the coronation's aftermath. Jack finally turning, voice raw as he recounted the line Victor had crossed, the secret deals, the lives nearly destroyed, the trap that would have burned half the city just to crown Victor victorious again, the words spilling out like confession and indictment intertwined, Matt interjecting with names and dates, receipts of betrayal stacked like bricks until the walls closed in. Victor listening with a stillness that unnerved them both, the calculating calm of a man absorbing intelligence, not remorse. And when Jack demanded acknowledgement, demanded change, Victor answered with silence that screamed louder than any threat, because submission was not in his vocabulary, the storm outside intensifying as if echoing the war inside the room, hours bleeding into each other while Jack paced and Matt watched, each man cracking in different ways under the pressure of holding a legend captive, Jack haunted by memories of shared victories and failures, of a rivalry that had once felt like sport, now reduced to a crime that would brand him forever, Matt fueled by a colder fire, convinced that this was the only language Victor understood, that mercy would be mistaken for weakness, and when Victor finally spoke through the gag after Jack loosened it just enough to let words through, the promise that poured out was chilling, a vow of reckoning so absolute it left no room for doubt, Victor swearing that when he walked free he would dismantle them piece by piece, not in rage but with surgical precision, families first, legacies second, souls last, Jack flinching as if struck while Matt only smiled thinly, replying that this was exactly why Victor wasn't walking free, not yet, not until the truth was dragged into daylight and the game board reset without Victor's thumb on the scale, the tension snapping as headlights suddenly cut through the trees outside. All three men freezing, the sound of gravel crunching like a death knell, Jack's heart slamming as he reached for the hidden compartment, convinced the Newmans had already found them, Matt drawing a weapon he prayed he wouldn't need, Victor's eyes lighting with feral hope, but the visitor was unexpected, a ghost from Jack's past whose arrival complicated everything, bringing news that Genoa City was imploding faster than they'd anticipated, alliances fracturing, accusations flying, Nikki demanding answers, Victoria preparing a corporate scorched earth campaign, Nick threatening violence, and worse, a third player moving in the shadows to exploit Victor's disappearance for their own endgame. The realization crashing over Jack and Matt that kidnapping Victor had not paused the war but accelerated it, that every hour he remained missing increased the body count of collateral damage, Jack's resolve wavering as he confronted the possibility that in trying to save the city, he might be condemning it. Victor seizing on that doubt with predatory instinct, offering a deal that tasted like poison, information in exchange for release, secrets that could stop the chaos if Jack would just trust him one last time. The word trust hanging in the air like a cruel joke, Matt arguing they couldn't believe a syllable, Jack torn as the visitor confirmed the threat was real and growing, the clock ticking louder with every breath, Victor pressing his advantage, revealing just enough to prove he held the key, names whispered. That made Jack's blood run cold, connections that rewrote assumptions and exposed a conspiracy even Victor hadn't fully controlled. The irony biting deep as Jack realized the man he'd kidnapped might be the only one who could stop what was coming, the storm outside breaking into thunder as the cabin shook, mirroring Jack's internal collapse, the choice before him impossible. Keep Victor bound and risk the city burning, or release a monster and gamble everything on a promise from a man who had never kept one unless it served him. Matt's eyes hardening as he warned that freeing Victor would undo everything they'd sacrificed, that there would be no second chances, Victor watching them both with a predator's patience, knowing time was his ally, Jack finally stepping forward, hands trembling as he loosened the restraints just enough to signal a shift, not freedom but leverage, telling Victor this was his last chance to tell the whole truth, every layer, every accomplice, because if he lied even once, the cabin would become his tomb. Victor inhaling deeply, savoring the moment like oxygen after drowning, and then he began to speak, unraveling a web so vast it reframed every betrayal, every death, every alliance of the past year. Names colliding with motives, secrets detonating one after another until Jack felt the ground of certainty crumble beneath him, realizing that this next chapter was no longer about kidnapping or revenge but about survival in a war where no one was clean, not even the men who believed they were doing the right thing. The cabin now the epicenter of a storm that would soon tear through Genoa City with devastating force, because once Victor Newman started talking, there would be no going back, and whatever decision Jack made next would decide not just Victor's fate, but the fate of everyone who had ever crossed his path. The next chapter erupted like a fault line finally giving way, the cabin no longer a refuge but a crucible as Victor's revelations unfurled with ruthless momentum, each name he dropped detonating another pocket of disbelief in Jack's chest while Matt's jaw tightened with every connection exposed, the truth spiraling outward to reveal that Victor's disappearance had been anticipated, even engineered into someone else's larger design. A shadow syndicate feeding on Newman Enterprises' fractures, manipulating markets, blackmailing judges, greasing law enforcement just enough to turn chaos into cover, Victor admitting with brutal candor that he had flirted with their power, believing he could dominate them as he always had, only to discover too late that he'd become a variable they were willing to erase, Jack reeling as the irony slammed home. Kidnapping Victor hadn't started the war, it had interrupted an execution, and yet interruption came with consequences, because Genoa City was already bleeding, stock prices free-falling, arrests made on planted evidence, reputations incinerated overnight, Nikki cutting through red tape with ferocious clarity while Victoria launched a corporate counteroffensive so aggressive it threatened to collapse entire sectors. Nick chasing ghosts and informants with a recklessness that terrified those who loved him, the city devouring itself in Victor's absence as if addicted to his gravity, the cabin door slamming open again with another arrival, bearing worse news that a body had been found, a message carved into flesh meant for Victor but delivered to everyone else. The syndicate announcing its presence with a signature so unmistakable Victor went still, recognition flashing across his face like grief he refused to name, Jack demanding answers as Matt swore under his breath, Victor finally conceding the depth of his miscalculation, that this enemy didn't want money or power alone but spectacle, the public dismantling of the Newman myth to prove no dynasty was untouchable, Jack's hands shaking as he realized the clock had shifted from hours to minutes, that Victor alive but hidden was a liability while Victor visible, whether free or captured, would draw fire like a beacon. Matt arguing for relocation, deeper cover, but Victor cutting through with icy authority, insisting the only move was offense, baiting the syndicate with his re-emergence under controlled conditions, a trap within a trap, Jack incredulous at the audacity of planning another gambit while bound to a chair, Victor meeting his gaze with a force that reminded Jack why he'd feared and admired him for decades. The king reclaiming command even in chains, Jack torn between revulsion and reluctant respect, knowing Victor's plan made terrifying sense, the syndicate's psychology built on humiliation and control, a public sighting of Victor would force them into the open, Matt warning that it would also put a target on every Newman and Abbott within reach. Victor acknowledging the cost without blinking, stating flatly that wars were won by those willing to lose something first. The room thick with silence as Jack weighed the morality of unleashing Victor back into the world, memories crashing. Every betrayal, every stolen victory. Against the immediate threat of innocent blood. The storm outside breaking at last, rain hammering the roof as if urging a decision, Jack stepping forward, cutting the remaining restraints not as forgiveness but as strategy, telling Victor this was conditional, that one misstep would end with him back in darkness or worse. Victor rising slowly, muscles stiff, dignity intact, nodding once with the gravity of a man accepting terms he fully intended to bend, Matt bristling but moving to assist, the three men forming an alliance so volatile it could only exist under apocalypse, the plan unfolding at breakneck speed, burner phones activated, decoys arranged, a controlled leak engineered to suggest Victor had escaped his captors wounded but alive, the narrative seeded through whispers and markets rather than headlines, Jack orchestrating from the shadows with a precision that surprised even him, Matt coordinating muscle and logistics, Victor becoming both bait and blade. And when Victor finally stepped into the daylight again, hood pulled low, the forest exhaling around him, the sense of inevitability was suffocating, because Genoa City would feel this shift like a pressure drop before a hurricane. And it did, almost instantly, calls lighting up, watchers stirring, the syndicate testing the signal with probes that snapped shut on decoys, Victor smiling thinly as he read their tells, the predator recognizing fellow predators, Jack watching from a distance as Victor slipped back into his element with terrifying ease, issuing instructions, predicting moves, sacrificing pawns with cold arithmetic, the line between saving the city and reclaiming his throne blurring by the second, Matt confronting Jack with the fear they'd both avoided naming, that Victor wouldn't stop once the syndicate was crushed, that this would only sharpen him, Jack unable to deny it, yet pressing on because there was no alternative left that didn't end in mass ruin. The first real strike landing before nightfall, a financial ambush that exposed the syndicate's shell companies, froze accounts, forced a countermove, Victor laughing quietly as the trap began to close, but the victory was poisoned when news broke of a kidnapping in retaliation, a Newman ally taken, blood on Victor's hands by proxy, the weight of it briefly dimming his eyes before hardening them again, Jack confronting him in a heated exchange that crackled with rage and regret, Victor countering that this was the cost of ending the war decisively, that half measures would only prolong the suffering, Matt stepping between them as sirens wailed in the distance, the city now an active battlefield, alliances shifting hourly, Jack realizing with a sinking clarity that by freeing Victor he hadn't restored balance, he'd unleashed acceleration, a force that would resolve the conflict swiftly but brutally, the final pieces sliding into place as Victor prepared to walk into the open at a high-profile event, daring the syndicate to strike where everyone could see, the gamble absolute, the stakes existential, Jack watching from the edge as Victor straightened his suit, every inch the indomitable titan once more, turning to Jack with a look that held something like gratitude buried beneath layers of steel, promising that when this was over debts would be settled, accounts reconciled, Jack knowing that promise cut both ways, the night swallowing Victor as he stepped forward to meet his fate head-on, the city holding its breath, because the next explosion, literal or figurative, would not just decide who won, but what kind of world would be left standing when the smoke finally cleared.